Okay, good afternoon. Thanks for coming. I was kind of hoping for a smaller crowd so that I'd be less embarrassed, but this should be fun. The downside of having a conference in your hometown is that the procrastination is even worse. And when you're used to flying 15 hours around the world from Australia, the 15 hours that you would have spent building your slides coming from Australia, you don't really have. So these are a little skinny because I've actually focused on my other talk in the afternoon, which is on the platform. But what I'm planning to do is we'll go through a bit of the basics, a bit of history, and I want to have a look at through the code so we can have a look at how things are structured and how it can be really easy to build some plugins. So for those of you who don't know me, there's the wall of text that you can't read that tells you everything about me. Basically, at the moment, I'm a software engineer for eBay, which are currently hosting us. And my role there at eBay is as a software engineer working on Joomla-related projects. So we have the Data Hub, which is actually a 1.5 site that's been butchered and taken apart and put back together and sort of still resembles Joomla in the administrator. But it's where we built our UCM platform from that we've been talking about for a while. And we have a version out there, and we're also working on contributing a slightly more up-to-date version with some innovations that we've worked on. And lately I've been working on Compass, which is a platform-based application. It's a 3-tier thing. If you've been to Lewis's talk, I think he had a chat about it. It's a tool that we're giving to our sellers, currently in a beta, so that they can analyze how they're doing in the marketplace and looking over things. Just in Joomla in general, I work on JAuthTools, obviously, which is why I'm talking about it. Long time ago, I did the 1.0 to 1.5 migrator, so if any of you still hate me for that, please leave. Anyone who loves me, please come to the front. I built the update manager as well, which was something I built for 1.0 to basically for all my clients. I got sick of FTPing files all over the place, and I'm like, there's got to be a better way, so I just built that as a quick and nasty, threw it out there, and people actually like it, which was kind of weird for me, but cool. I also work on the platform doing stuff with authentication, with the installer, some of the update stuff. And I have some smaller extensions, like I have a tool to ban IP addresses from your site. I have a tool that basically helps you get the right domain name for your site. So if you've got a www, but you've got all of these vhosts that point to it, the SEO canonicalization plugin will make sure that anytime somebody hits your site, it's from the right domain, which is cool. So in 1.0, I actually started building all of this. And my aim in 1.0 was to build an LDAP integration for Joomla that didn't require hacking the core. Because all of the extensions at the time said, so what you do is you replace this file and this file and this file, and then when you upgrade, it all breaks. Right. And you spend 5 minutes looking at your site and going, why can't I log in? It worked yesterday. And then you realize, oh, I upgraded it yesterday and everything's now broken. So I had a few different things here. And what I want to show is that actually a lot of this has come a long way. So the Joomla LDAP bot was perhaps the first of the library plugin manbot things. And it's now JClient LDAP in the current platform. The SSI plugin manbot is now the authentication plugin in 1.5. The eDirectory thing got killed because nobody uses eDirectory anymore. The synchronization thing is now JAuthTools Sync. The Kerberos integration became the HTTP plugin, and the JLogger API, after years of sitting around doing absolutely nothing, finally got into an updated version of JLog, mostly actually due to Lewis helping clean that up in platform 11.4. So this project has a bit of history in its code. So one of the things I found, and that looks a little off, but I had these 3 main plugins, manbots, and what they would do is authenticate a user or detect a user, find or create the user account, and then log the user in. And all 3 plugins, manbots, had the exact same code. All 3 of them did roughly the exact same thing. The top tier, for the most part, was slightly different. So the SSI went off to LDAP, bound the user account, and checked that they worked. The SSO was actually the eDirectory thing, and used some really horrible black magic in eDirectory to work out who you were from your IP address. not recommended. And Kerberos was actually an Active Directory thing. For those of you who are familiar with Windows, this is how single sign-on is done today. It's a great system. It uses tickets, but all three of them still managed to do that. And ostensibly, all they went back to was an LDAP database to try and work out who the hell you were, and then did some munging in the session. Now, part of this was because in 1.0, we didn't have a way of easily reusing code. And with 1.5, what we had was the ability to make use of the Joomla user plugins. So we could now call the Joomla user plugins and say, log me in. And we could trigger an event off, and it would log the user in. So that just left the other two tiers of the tree to look after. So creating a user account became the job of user source plugins. And as we'll have a look at later, basically the aim is that a user source is a repository of users that allows you to create a Joomla account from them. And the SSO plugins, the entire aim of them is to work out from the request who the user is. And all we're after is a username. So SSO libraries and plugins identify the username, very simple. And user source libraries retrieve the user from a given username. So for 1.5, what we have in terms of plugins is a lot. So the system plugins, we have plugins to do single sign-on, so that every time a user hits a site, we automatically log you in. We have tools to do synchronization. So if you have an LDAP directory that is your point of truth, which if you're in an enterprise, should be the point of truth. You may also have, in the past, a university in, I'm going to stuff this up, Prague maybe, no, Lithuania, Vilnius. They have their source of truth was actually Oracle. So I wrote a plugin, user source plugin for them that went off to Oracle, and they also had a weird single sign-on mechanism that tied into all of this. So they have I wrote a user source and SSO plugin for them. So we have, by default, an LDAP plugin, which allows you to actually pull stuff out of LDAP in a reasonably standard manner. And that works for the most part with Active Directory, eDirectory. I usually test on Open Directory, which is Apple's one, and OpenLDAP. And there's also a session plugin, which I'll talk about a little bit later. And that's for handling some different SSO stuff. So in the SSO stuff, I have Simple SSO, which was a SSO protocol I built a while back to integrate with Google before Google would actually let you do any sort of single sign-on. Long before they supported OAuth and all of that, the only way to sign into a Google account was actually to go to the Gmail, and that had an RSS feed that you could pipe a username and password through, which would then validate you. Simple SSO was an implementation on Google App Engine, which allowed you to directly authenticate through Google, and you never saw the password. HTTP is there for those times where perhaps if you're on an IIS server, you just tick the integrated Windows authentication box in IIS Manager, and it pipes through a whole bunch of environment variables, and we just pick that out of the thing. OpenID, which is about to get shot because I've decided that it has no future, unfortunately. Mozilla, actually, I was working with them on Friday on implementing Browser ID, which is their new solution for it. So instead of, the main problem I had with OpenID is we were expecting users to type in a URL for themselves. And I'm not sure how many of you have general users who know what URL they are. My best test case was my sister, who said, I don't have a URL. So OpenID was great for geeks, but not so good for the end user. Mozilla's new program is basically based around email addresses, and they have two tiers. So they have a fallback, so that if your domain isn't supported to do authentication directly, they'll become the IDP for you, the identity provider. If your domain does support that, and they have a discovery protocol, they'll actually go off to your domain and authenticate your users via the same system. And that's something I'm working on. IP was a very simple example of using IP addresses. So I came from a university sector, and you'd be surprised how many systems actually rely on IP-based authentication just to log somebody in. So you'd sign up to a journal, and you wouldn't hand over usernames or passwords. You'd say, these are the IP addresses that we're going to access this journal from. So IP was a simple example, and token login is the last of my SSO plugins. Token login was a project to work out a secure way of logging a user in from a URL token. It was aimed at, I got sick of Joomla Social sending me these notifications that would include this link to this thing. You'd click on it, it'd redirect you to the login page, you'd log in, and then you'd go to the home page of some Joomla Social page, and it'd be like, why? So token login, I never really worked on publicizing it enough. It was basically a generic library so that you could build URLs that had time-based limitations. So the URL would automatically log the user in for, say, a week. It had use limitations, so it would track each time it would be used. So you could limit its use to, say, 5 times. So any more than 5 times, the token becomes invalid. And you could also, obviously, manually revoke things. Moving along, I had a few other things. The token login had a component to manage it. And perhaps the most interesting was, a while back, I wrote an LDAP user synchronization plugin. So this was used by Linux.com, I think, actually. And they use it to when they log in, they create the user accounts. You?
I work on it.
You work on it?
Yeah.
Cool. So the suckers. They use that to when you sign up to Linux.com, goes off to LDAP and creates a thing for you. And there's a few other things here. Advanced Gmail is now actually in 1.6 onwards, which has allowed you to, if you're using Google Apps for your domain, what you can do is in the Gmail plugin now, and what you couldn't do in 1.5, is set a context or a domain for which you want to log in from. So what you could do is you could actually use this plugin to integrate with Google Apps straight out of the box with Joomla 1.5 or 1.6, and the username and password would be the same. I'm not sure how well that was taken, but that's cool. Whoops. So I'm lazy. I'm currently working on an updated release, and that's what I'm actually going to show you through the code for. I dislike writing slides because that means work, and as a coder, non-coding work is not really fun. I'm also working on, with this release, basically working on making the libraries generic enough so that we can put them in the platform. At the moment, the entire system is architected around plugins, which is great for the CMS, but as soon as you move into platform applications, they're not as useful, right? So to fire up the entire plugin system just to authenticate a user is perhaps not the greatest idea. So one of the things I'm working on, and I have 2 weeks holiday coming up, which I'm planning on just hacking on, which will be great, is rethinking how the authentication system in Joomla works and moving slightly away from plugins to a system where we'll still have plugins for the CMS, but the core underlying libraries, like the LDAP plugin, which goes off and connects to LDAP and does all of that stuff, that'll be just in one place, and then the plugin, all it will do is it will instantiate this library and authenticate the user. And I'm working on doing the same thing top down for everything here. So one of the things we have is a 3-tier architecture. And the reason we've done that is sometimes some of the parts will already work for you. So if you're using an IIS box, the HTTP plugin will work straight out of the box for you. You're not going to need any extra configuration because it's already going to go off and pull those user details out. But what you may not need may have is a custom user source plugin. Now, when I started on this, all of the software as a service stuff was still really new. But increasingly, we're seeing tools like Salesforce, Google is now picking up, Facebook, and a few other places where your users are not necessarily how your users' information is not necessarily how they log in. So the idea of splitting these up is that we can reuse code, we can mix and match stuff, and then at the end of the day, the framework basically calls everything and throws it out for you. So how many people here are developers and how many are integrators? Developers? Cool, that's most of the room. Integrators? Windows system administrators? 3, 4, 5? Okay, cool. 6. Unfortunately, I don't have a copy of Windows, but we'll work on that. So this is slightly more developer focused, which is good because that's still the majority of the room. So an SSO plugin is actually really simple. We have a detect remote user function. This returns the username of your user and returns false if you don't find the user. Now for the IP address based one, which I'll show you shortly, it's very simple. If the IP address is in the list, the IP, this is this user. Some of the other ones are slightly more complicated, but fundamentally the same basic principle is that you need to work out what the username is. One of the other things you can do in an SSO plugin is, if you're using the session user source plugin, is if your SSO mechanism for some reason also returns back those user details. So for example, if you're using OpenID, OpenID will return you back in the same request all of the information about the user. And if you want to rely on that information for whatever reason, if you trust OpenID for whatever reason, to give you all of that data, then you can put that into the session, and there's a user source plugin that'll just pick that up for you. But the main method here is detect remote user. So for user source plugins, conversely, the next method is get user. And as you can see, we accept a username and a user object. And the aim of this is that using whatever heuristics you want to, you get the username and you go off. Built in is obviously the LDAP stuff, so we do an LDAP bind and a search for the user details, and then we populate that. Again, if you have a web service or something that you want to call, you can do that there. And basically, you just populate user with those details, and because of the way it's structured with the plugins, you can actually have multiple plugins, and whatever order they're in, they can just populate data over the top. So that ends the slides because, as I said, I'm not so good on slides. And starts the code. So while I'm sort of in between things, are there any questions that people have on the basic structure? Yes? No? Good? Awesome. I wonder if that's readable enough, actually. Let's try a... Ooh. Don't do that. Wrong presentation. Let's just use this one. Is that readable for those of you hiding up the back and not looking? Yes? Can we see that? Yeah, not really.
The comments are hard to read. The comments you can't.
Let's see if, actually I'd have to change.
I mean, I think the comments are hard to read. Everything else is fine.
Everything else is fine?
Most of the code is white.
Yeah, most of the code should be pretty bright colors for this. Font's a little small, but I'm not sure I can easily change that. So, there we go. Is that big enough for everyone to read? Okay, so let's have a look. So this is the LDAP user source plugin. So as you can see, we have our get user function. As I noted, I'm still porting this up. And in this particular case, we actually rely on the basic LDAP authentication plugin. So when you configure the base LDAP authentication plugin for your website, we actually pick that up and grab that information as well. And we also, even if that plugin is disabled, but it still has configuration parameters, we worked around the API and suck it out. So essentially, we connect, we bind, and we try to update the user. It's really quite simple. Session is another example, and this is perhaps even easier again, where all you need to do as a developer is, in this case, we're retrieving the session, we're getting the data out of it, and this could be a web service call that we're doing instead of, in this case, we're using JSession and relying on another plugin, but we could be using a web service call to retrieve this information. We do some basic checks, and then we go through and we set up the user with all of the details. And this is all you need to do, and then I return true or return false. User source plugins also have a do user sync option, which isn't used as much, and that allows you to handle synchronizing individual user accounts in a two-way mechanism. Whereas get user is much more designed to just retrieve the user account, and then the libraries will work out what they want to do with it. So that's a very simple example of a session plugin. And if we have a look at the IP, so this is a slightly more complicated example. This is an example of a SSO plugin, and this is the IP address one. So it has two modes. It supports using an IP address that you can configure, and in that mode, basically, whomever comes from that IP address gets logged in as whatever that user is. And by default, we log them in as admin because that's nice and secure, and that's what everyone wants. But there's also a very simple table that allows you to list an IP address and a username. And so if you have, perhaps for the university example, you're dealing with places where the IP address is the trusted identity, you can use that with a given username because most places have institutional logins to identify the user, and then it becomes very simple. Work out what the remote IP address is, and is this someone we know? It also supports doing IP ranges, but yeah, I never really liked that as a feature. So in this particular case, we're looking at the request, we're looking at the IP address, and we're working backwards to find what the username is. Now, there are also two other types of plugins that I've sort of not mentioned as much. So what we have is, that's the wrong one, that one, back here, is what I call type B plugins. Now, simple SSO, so IP address authentication works fine if you're handling all of the identification in the same request. But OpenID and many other systems are now encouraging you to send the user off somewhere else and then redirect them back into your application. So you don't, in the same request as they hit the site, immediately authenticate the user. So in JAuthTools, what we've done with that is we actually have two extra types of plugins that are configured via an XML file. And these plugins support returning a service provider link in the plugin configuration. So in this case, we're getting if the component is installed in the website, we grab that and we redirect the user back to that, and we also rewrite their landing page. Now, what this enables us to do as a project is that if you have an example, in this case the simple SSO, where you need to redirect to Google, have the login occur there, and then they're going to come back to you via a callback URL. What this allows you to do is generate the link for the user to go off to that location. Now, depending on your project, you may wish to always force someone through that. And what you can do is you can, we don't have it at the moment, but it's one of the things on my list, is a plugin that will automatically validate that we have a valid username, a valid user account, and then basically pick up the currently set up authentication plugins and send them to that service provider link automatically. This integrates with the component and the module that we have, so that there's a link in the module that says log into whatever site, and in the component there's also a link area, but the module makes much more sense to me. So that's what we call a type B. Now, one of the interesting things about type B plugins is that they have different operations that can occur. So in this case, we allow people to do different items, and we have a state map that allows people to transition through it. With type C plugins, we don't have any of that. It's much simpler. So actually, Ian wrote this, wherever he is. Did I see? There he is. So Ian wrote this one for me a while back. And this is a type C plugin for OpenID. And in this case, we have the same detect remote user functionality, but we then, if they're not authenticating properly, send them off to the consumer to complete the session. And so we go through the full OpenID process, get the response, check that, and go from there. Now, Type C plugins allow you to specify a form so that it's much more like a login box. So in this case, we're using a form to put in the username, which is actually technically the URL that you would go through. And that allows you to do stuff where the user needs to provide some credentials first before they get to go to the identity provider. And in the case of OpenID, that's a URL so that we know what website and which identity provider we want to actually use in this particular case. So that's an example of a Type C plugin. Anyone bored yet? Yeah, only one person. Lewis, you don't count. Now, what do I have? This is a redirect token login. I wonder if this is going to work properly. I'm going to borrow my 1.5 site because I broke my 1.6 site and 3.0 site this morning, which is bad of me. And hopefully this is... Apparently I can't type. No, that did. You can see I just have a few extensions on this particular site. So this is the current UI, and I'm working on updating this. Some horrible people, myself included, decided they want to rewrite half of Joomla. Don't know why, but it makes your life easier. Come to my talk later, and we get to show awesome. So we have a SSO plugin that you can configure. We have a list of plugins, and we can see eDirectory, and we can see the different types. So the Google integration is a Type C because we're taking a form and going off. We have simple SSO and a few other things. And what you can do from here is, for the login via Google, configure the options to set your IDP and have a username suffix. This is all configurable through the UI. And the only other thing I want to show, because I've never shown it at a presentation before, is token login. Now, the main aim of token login was the API. So the API is designed around issuing URLs. So in this particular case, you can see that I'm not an extension developer because those strings, not so translated. But what it allows you to do is specify a username, admin, expiry, I think -1 should work, and a particular landing page. I wonder if this will work. Save. So what it does is, I now have a token. I have 5 remaining logins, expires at -1, and then I have a login URL. Invalid token, because the token expiry has to be a valid. There we go. I'll go to Google. Expire this. Still invalid. I hate it when a demo doesn't work. There we go. That worked. So let's just copy that because that's address. So what it does is it has a secure token. Now when we store this in the database, we actually hash it again. So what we do is, instead of storing this actual login token in the database, we provide when you create the URL, we provide a method to get to derive this particular token so that you can't directly just sniff it out of the database. And this enables us then to have a bit more security, because otherwise, with just the URL in the request, somebody could just sniff that and use it to replay. Why isn't that looking at? Oh, I have a fake Community Builder login plugin. Who here uses Community Builder? 1, 2, 3. Have you ever tried to get it to authenticate with anything other than your Joomla site?
Yeah, not successful.
So I have something for you. Come chat later. But I have some tools that will allow you to get past Community Builder. Yeah, the way they did their authentication thing, it doesn't quite work, but I have as you can see, a fake Community Builder login thing that impersonates it and works for single sign-on stuff. At this point, I think I've said enough. And let's just hit play on that. Are there any questions?
The one last thing that you showed with the token, did you say the token was time sensitive, so they have a certain amount of time?
Yes. Yeah, the token is time sensitive, so that you can issue it for a week. And so if the user gets the email, looks at the email, clicks the email, then it's valid for them. If after a week they click on it, then they probably go back through your normal login flow. But the trade-off there is usability versus security, because if the token sat in your inbox for like 3 months, and then somebody, maybe your account gets compromised for whatever reason, then all of those tokens are still going to be valid, and I don't think that as a system is a good idea. And that's also the same reason there's a use limit as well. So it defaults to a limit of five uses before it automatically expires the token, so that you can't just keep using it to impersonate the person. You have to sooner or later actually get another token or log in. Any other questions?
Have you ever worked with any authentication with Twitter or login with Twitter?
Not with Twitter, no. But if it's just a simple API, that'd be a Type-C plugin. You just redirect them back through, go to Twitter, can come back, and you just set up the callback URL. And it fires in that case, you'd use the component, and the component would fire off the plugin, handle the authentication, and then send the user to wherever they need it to be in the app.
Then what if, because I had a client who wanted to keep the session open, like forever?
Forever? Well, in that case, you'd probably want to just set the Remember Me cookie, and then the Remember Me cookie would next time they come back to Joomla, it would log them in as their Joomla account, instead of relying on Twitter to have to go back through Twitter to reauth.
So what's your sense of who's going to win the authentication wars?
Which set of wars?
Like OpenID versus Mozilla versus Google login.
So OpenID in my mind has already lost. They lost a couple of years ago. I think the sign that OpenID lost was when Google said they've implemented OpenID but use an email address, and it's completely incompatible with every other OpenID library. And by the way, thanks. That was for me when OpenID lost. That when people were implementing it, but all of the implementations started being incompatible. And I was a very early user of OpenID, and I liked it as a concept. And I have a live journal, which obviously was what kicked all of this off. So I had the URL, that was fine. And then I realized at some point I didn't really want to log in via LiveJournal anymore, because I'd kind of grown up, so to speak. And then at that point I realized it's like, well, if I'd moved on, if I had everything tied to that URL, then I was up the creek. I'm less likely to want to throw away my email address, simply because as soon as I do that, I shoot myself in the foot in almost everywhere else. So I like Browser ID as an implementation. I've been playing with it. It's not on this laptop, it's actually on my other laptop. But basically, the way it works, at the moment it's a polyfill for all of the browsers, so that, because it's not supported yet. But the idea is that with Firefox OS, it'll automatically log in each time you go to a site. And for me, I think the really interesting thing is that it's actively trying to sign you in. So when you come back to your site, if Joomla says that you're not signed in, Browser ID will actually automatically attempt to sign you in, because it knows that you've logged into the site before. So you don't have to go off to Twitter or Facebook or somewhere else to re-authenticate, because the browser knows you want to go there. And I think that's actually really a lot better, because my hope there is that it will reduce phishing attacks. Because the problem with the web is that everyone has a login box. And what Browser ID gives you is the ability that eventually the browser will take care of the login box for you. So it can do better checks, and it can protect you from people being malicious. that's the same reason that Facebook, I think, has risks, because people see Facebook login and they just type their Facebook username and password, and I just can't fathom how many passwords have just been captured through fake Facebook pages. And the great thing about it is that they can then, you actually use that username and password and look like it's actually working and redirect the user back to their site, but they now know your Facebook username and password. So that's not so good. Google, I think, have a slightly better chance, just because they have more trust systems in place, and people trust Google slightly more than Facebook. But that's a capital thing. So I kind of hope that the browser ID stuff will take off, just because I like it as a technology a little bit better, and because Firefox being Firefox, Mozilla being Mozilla, I should say, they're much more open web people. And if you want to basically start taking control of your own email domain, they'll let you do that. Whereas with Google, it's either Google or we don't like you, and if they don't like you, you can just Google to see how bad that can be. Sadly enough. Any other questions?
Can this be used to secure Ajax stores or external
So the token stuff you could use, if it's a redirected login, if you're redirecting off to Google or Facebook or somewhere else, or OpenID site, then that's obviously not going to work for Ajax. But if you're using the type A stuff, which authenticates you based on the initial request, then that will just work for those things. Once you have a session in Joomla, you shouldn't need to do any reauth anyway for most of those things anyway, because if with your Ajax requests, they should by default already include the Joomla session information, if that makes sense. Any other questions? Yes?
You ever worked with mobile and having it authenticate via like the SIM card or something like that? Is that kind of down the line?
No, because I don't think that any of the web stuff can get to that layer safely. Or, well, I think you can do it on Apple devices with the app, but they kind of don't want you to, is essentially how that works. So, yeah, no.
Can you do then logins via web services, or is that something totally different?
That's something totally different. Well, if sort of, it depends. What do you mean by web services? What sort of web services?
Well, if I understand web services based off the other sessions, it's basically getting data that's independent from actual platform or whatever that you're on. So you can log in like via your phone without having to go on a browser, but rather through an application on the phone.
Yeah, you could set up. So one of the research projects I did that I never finished was using HTTPS certificates, SSL certificates, to identify users. And then basically you enroll your phone with a certificate, which is very common in Enterprise, where they control a full CA path, certificate authority, and then that would be used to authenticate you. And then it sort of works with the HTTP plugin, but slightly different. And that would then be completely browserless, and you could use that. But you'd be submitting the certificate with a request. Anything else? Going once? Going twice? Lunch!